In the heart of the bustling town of Umuzi, there stood a modest building with a faded blue door and a sign that read, Jide's Sharp Cuts. Jide was not just an ordinary barber. He was a living legend whose reputation preceded him across 7 neighboring villages. He was a tall, soft-spoken man with an aura of mystery, but it was his hands that truly drew the crowds. Jide possessed an incredible, almost supernatural speed when it came to cutting hair. While a standard fade or a complex lineup would take an average barber nearly an hour, Jide could finish a client in exactly 10 minutes. No matter the texture of the hair or the intricacy of the style requested, he never exceeded his self-imposed time limit. Men traveled from far and wide, bypassing dozens of other salons, just to experience the Jide magic. The shop was constantly packed with customers who marveled at the fact that they could walk in looking shaggy and walk out looking like movie stars before their lunch break was even over. They praised his precision and his clean finishes, calling him the golden hands of Umuzi. However, despite the fame and the constant stream of satisfied customers, there was one chilling, non-negotiable condition for anyone seeking a haircut. The rule at Jide's Sharp Cuts was simple but absolute. No mirrors or anything capable of showing a reflection were allowed inside the shop. In a profession where mirrors are usually the centerpiece, Jide's walls were hauntingly bare. There were no wall-mounted glasses, no polished metal surfaces, and no vanity stations. Jide was so militantly strict with this rule that he employed a nervous young apprentice named Kofi specifically to enforce it. Every man who stepped through the door was subjected to a thorough search. Kofi would check pockets, bags, and even wristwatches to ensure no reflective surfaces entered the workspace. Empty your pockets, Kofi would whisper to the waiting men. Phone screens must be turned off and faced down. If you have a polished lighter or a shiny tin of pomade, leave it in the locker outside. Jide himself would stand by the barber's chair, his sharp eyes scanning every new arrival with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. If I see a reflection, Jide would warn in a voice like grinding stones, the haircut stops immediately. You will be asked to leave and you will never be allowed back. People wondered why he was so obsessed with this strange prohibition, but most didn't bother to ask. The townspeople often debated the reason behind the no mirror rule over drinks at the local square. Some argued that Jide was simply an eccentric artist who didn't want the distraction of clients constantly checking his work midway. Others suggested he was insecure about his specific techniques and didn't want anyone to study how he moved his clippers so fast. However, as long as the fades were crisp and the service was the fastest in the country, the majority of the men in Umuzi were willing to trade their curiosity for convenience. They accepted the darkness of the shop and the strange searches as a small price to pay for perfection. One day, a wealthy and arrogant young man named Obi decided to visit the salon for the first time. Obi was a man who lived for his reflection, spending hours in front of the glass every morning. He had heard of Jide's speed, but found the idea of a mirrorless salon to be an insult to his status. He believed the rules didn't apply to a man of his wealth. He arrived at the shop wearing an expensive silk jacket, hiding a small, high-polished silver cigarette case in an inner pocket that Kofi's hurried search failed to detect. Obi sat in the barber's chair with a smirk on his face, watching Jide prepare the clippers. The atmosphere in the shop was heavy, filled with the rhythmic humming of the tools. As Jide began to work, Obi felt the incredible speed for himself. The blades moved like lightning, yet the touch was as light as a feather. Unable to contain his vanity, Obi waited for a moment when Jide stepped to the side. He slowly slid the silver case from his pocket and tilted it just enough to catch a glimpse of his hairline in the reflection. In an instant, the atmosphere changed. Jide let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed off the bare walls. He dropped his clippers, which continued to buzz erratically on the floor. "How dare you!" Jide shrieked, his eyes bulging with a terror that looked like pure madness. "Who asked you to bring a reflection into this sanctuary? Did I not warn you?" The other customers gasped, pulling back in their seats. Obi stumbled out of the chair,
his heart hammering against his ribs. "It's just a kiss," he stammered, but Jide was pointing a trembling finger at the door. "Out! Get out now before the shadows take notice." Obi fled, his haircut half finished. The incident with Obi only added to the dark mystique surrounding Jide's sharp cuts. While many were frightened, a young man named Kwame found himself deeply intrigued. Kwame was a journalist by profession and a skeptic by nature. He didn't believe in eccentricities without a logical cause. To him, every strange behavior had a root, and Jide's reaction to the silver case suggested something far deeper than mere artistic temperament. Kwame decided to investigate the salon, but he knew he had to be careful. He entered the shop a few days later, submitting to Kofi's search with a polite smile. He sat in the chair and allowed Jide to begin the haircut. As the clippers hummed, Kwame kept his senses sharp. He noticed that Jide's hands were unnaturally cold, deathly cold, like ice against his skin. He also heard a faint, rhythmic clicking sound that didn't seem to come from the electric clippers Jide was holding. It sounded like multiple pairs of scissors, working in perfect unison, even though Jide's other hand was empty. Most unsettling of all was the low guttural whispering that seemed to emanate from the air just behind his ears. It was a language Kwame didn't recognize, filled with ancient, heavy vowels. "You have a remarkable talent, Jide," Kwame said softly, trying to gauge the barber's reaction. "To move this fast, to achieve such perfection in minutes, it's almost as if you aren't working alone." Jide's hand flinched, the cold metal of the clipper grazing Kwame's temple for a split second. A pained expression crossed Jide's face, a flicker of deep-seated exhaustion that he quickly masked with a forced smile. "It is just a gift, my friend, a gift I have carried since I was a child. Some are born to run, others to sing. I was born to cut." Kwame didn't push further, but he noticed that Jide's eyes kept darting to the corners of the room, as if he were checking for something invisible to everyone else. When the haircut was finished, Kwame looked at his reflection in a small puddle outside the shop. The work was flawless, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been in the presence of something forbidden. He knew he wouldn't find the answers by simply sitting in the chair. He needed to speak to someone who understood the old ways of Umuzi, someone who could see what the eyes of modern men ignored. The following morning, Kwame traveled to the outskirts of the town to visit an elderly man named Baba Tunde. Tunde was a renowned seer, a man said to possess the inner sight that allowed him to glimpse the spiritual world. Kwame sat on a woven mat and narrated his experience at Jide's salon. He described the speed, the freezing hand, the invisible clicking, and the absolute terror Jide showed toward mirrors. Baba Tunde sighed heavily, casting a set of ancient cowries onto the floor between them. He studied the pattern for a long time before speaking. "That man you saw is not just a barber," Tunde whispered, his voice trembling with age. "He is a vessel, a host for a shadow weaver." Kwame felt a chill run down his spine. "What is a shadow weaver?" he asked. Tunde explained that years ago, Jide's father, desperate for his son to escape the crushing poverty of their lineage, had made a pact with the spirit of the air. This spirit was a master of blades and speed, bound to Jide's hands from infancy. The spirit provided the skill and the fame, but it came with a terrifying price that Jide was forced to pay every single day of his life. "The shadow weaver is a vain and hideous creature," Babatunde continued. "It manifests whenever Jide begins his work. It stands over him, its multiple limbs moving with the speed of the wind. That is why the hair is finished so quickly. It is not Jide cutting, but the spirit using Jide's body as a conduit. However, spirits of that realm cannot bear to see their own reflection. To them, a mirror is a portal of judgment. If the spirit sees itself while it is active in our world, it is instantly and violently dragged back into the void. But because the pact is bound by blood, if the spirit is vanished while mid-task, it will take the host's life as payment for the broken contract." Kwame finally understood the weight of the no-mirror rule.
Jide wasn't protecting a secret, he was protecting his very life. Every time a customer reached for a phone or a piece of metal, Jide was staring into the face of his own death. The golden hands were actually golden handcuffs. Jide was a prisoner to a spectral entity that demanded total control over his environment, or it would kill him in a heartbeat. Kwame felt a surge of pity for the barber who lived in constant fear. Babatunde revealed more about the curse. Jide was not told of this pact until he was a young man. By then, the spirit had already integrated itself into his soul. He discovered that he could never marry, for the spirit is jealous and will not allow any other presence to claim Jide's devotion. He cannot leave the town for long, as the spirit requires the energy of the work to remain fed. He is a slave to the chair and the clippers. Kwame asked if there was any way to break the bond without killing Jide. Tunde looked at the cowries again. It is a dangerous path. To free him, the spirit must be trapped, not just vanished. It must be lured into a vessel that can hold its essence before the blood bond is severed. Kwame realized that he couldn't just walk away with this knowledge. Jide was a good man caught in a nightmare, and the town of Umuzi was unknowingly celebrating his torment. Kwame asked Tunde to help him prepare a way to save Jide. The old man hesitated, warning of the risks, but eventually agreed to create a spirit trap mirror, a glass treated with ancient oils and herbs that could bind a shadow weaver. Kwame spent the next few days gathering the materials Tunde required. He felt a sense of mission he had never experienced in his journalism career. This wasn't just a story anymore, it was a rescue operation. When the mirror was ready, it looked like a standard hand glass, but the surface had a strange, pearlescent sheen that seemed to move even when the air was still. You must choose the moment carefully, Tunde warned. Jide must be willing to let go. If he clings to the power the spirit gives him, the trap will fail and you will both be destroyed. Kwame returned to Jide's sharp cut late one evening, just as the last customer was leaving and Jide was preparing to close the shop. The barber looked more exhausted than ever, his hands shaking as he wiped down his tools. "We are closed, friend," Jide said without looking up. Kwame didn't move. "I know about the shadow weaver, Jide," he said quietly. The clippers in Jide's hand clattered to the floor. The barber turned slowly, his face ashen in the dim light of the shop. He didn't deny it. He didn't have the strength left to lie. He simply sank into his own barber chair and covered his face with his hands. "How long have you known?" Jide whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Kwame stepped closer. "I went to see Babatunde. He told me everything. He told me about the pact your father made and the price you have been paying ever since." Jide let out a hollow laugh. "The price? I have no life, Kwame. I am a ghost in my own body. Every morning I wake up and I pray that today is the day someone brings a mirror so I can finally rest. But I am a coward. I am too afraid to die. So I keep enforcing the rule, keep cutting the hair, and keep feeding the monster." Kwame held out the cloth-wrapped mirror. "You don't have to die to be free. Tunde has prepared a way to trap the spirit. We can end this tonight, but you have to trust me. You have to call the spirit forth one last time and let me face it." Jide looked at the bundle with a mixture of hope and pure, unadulterated terror. He knew that if this failed, he would not see the sunrise. But he also knew he couldn't spend another day as a host for the weaver. He stood up, his resolve hardening. "What do I need to do?" Jide asked, his voice steadying. Kwame explained the plan. Jide had to sit in the chair and begin the ritual of cutting, even if there was no client. He had to summon the full presence of the shadow weaver so that it was entirely manifested in the physical realm. Once the spirit was fully active, Kwame would reveal the spirit trap mirror. "The spirit will try to kill you the moment it realizes what is happening," Kwame warned. "You must stay focused. Do not stop the motion of your hands until I tell you." Jide nodded, taking a deep breath. He picked up his clippers and turned them on. The familiar hum filled the room, but this time it sounded darker, more aggressive. Jide began to move his hands through the air over a mannequin head, mimicking the lightning-fast strokes of his trade. The temperature in the shop plummeted instantly. Kwame stood in the corner, his hand on the cloth covering the mirror, his heart drumming a frantic rhythm. He could feel the change in the air. The space behind Jide began to shimmer and distort, as if the reality was being peeled back. Suddenly, the clicking sound returned, louder than ever before. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical vibration that rattled the windows. Kwame saw it then, a grey, translucent shape coalescing behind Jide. It had long, spindly limbs that ended in blades of bone, and its face was a featureless mask of malice. The spirit's arms were moving in perfect synchronization with Jide, his invisible shears slicing through the air with terrifying precision. Jide's face was contorted in pain, his skin turning a sickly shade of grey as the spirit drew more energy from him. Now, Jide gasped, his lungs straining under the pressure of the spirit's presence. Kwame stepped forward and ripped the cloth away from the mirror. The pearlescent glass caught the dim light and began to glow with a brilliant, pulsing blue radiance. The shadow weaver froze. For the first time in Jide's life, the spirit was forced to see itself. In the reflection of the trap mirror, the creature appeared even more monstrous, a tangled mess of ancient greed and sharp edges. It let out a shriek that wasn't heard by the ears, but felt in the very soul of everyone in the room. The spirit recoiled, its many arms flailing wildly. It tried to retreat back into Jide's shadow, but the mirror acted like a powerful vacuum, pulling at the spirit's essence. The room was filled with a swirling vortex of wind and shadow. Jide screamed as the bond began to tear, his body jerking as if he were being electrocuted. "Hold on, Jide!" Kwame shouted, bracing himself against the force of the spirit's resistance. The mirror grew hot in his hands, the glass vibrating with the trapped energy of the entity. The shadow weaver's form began to stretch and distort, its grey limbs being sucked into the glowing surface of the glass. The creature fought with a desperate, animalistic ferocity, its bone blades scraping against the walls of the shop, leaving deep, jagged gouges in the wood. Kwame felt his grip slipping, the power of the spirit nearly overwhelming him. But he thought of Jide's wasted years and the fear that had haunted this town. He planted his feet and held the mirror steady, directing its light directly into the center of the spirit's mass. With one final thunderous crack that sounded like a falling tree, the spirit was fully engulfed by the glass. The blue light vanished instantly, replaced by a dense, swirling black smoke trapped within the frame of the mirror. The temperature in the room returned to normal and the oppressive weight lifted. Jide collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his hands finally still. Kwame didn't waste a second. As Tunde had instructed, he placed the mirror face down on the concrete floor and picked up a heavy mallet he had brought for this purpose. With a powerful blow, he shattered the glass into 1,000 tiny pieces. The black smoke dissipated into the air, vanishing into nothingness. Jide lay on the floor for a long time, his chest heaving. Kwame knelt beside him, checking his pulse. It was strong and warm. When Jide finally opened his eyes, the hollow, haunted look was gone. He looked at his hands. They were steady and they were warm. "It's gone," Jide whispered, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his face. "I can feel my own heart again. The clicking, it's finally stopped." Kwame helped him up, and the two men stood in the middle of the ruined shop, surrounded by shattered glass and broken shadows. The news of what happened that night spread through Umuzi like wildfire, though the full details remained a secret between Jide, Kwame, and Babatunde. To the townspeople, it was simply the night Jide's shop was renovated. When the salon reopened a few weeks later, the transformation was staggering. The faded blue door was now a vibrant, welcoming gold. The most shocking change, however, was on the walls. Jide had installed large, beautiful mirrors behind every station. The searches at the door had ended. Coffee, no longer a nervous apprentice tasked with hunting for reflections, was now a smiling receptionist who offered tea to the customers. Jide still worked at the first chair, but things were different. He was no longer the golden hands who could finish a cut in 10 minutes. Now, a proper haircut took him 45 minutes, just like any other barber. He moved with a deliberate, careful grace, chatting with his clients and laughing at their jokes. Some of the customers who were always in a rush stopped coming, annoyed by the slower pace, but Jide didn't mind. He had traded speed for a soul, and he found the trade to be more than fair. Jide's life began to flourish in ways he had never thought possible. Without the jealous spirit looming over him, he was free to seek companionship. He soon met a kind woman named Amara, who worked at the local bakery. Their courtship was the talk of the town, a beautiful sight for those who had known Jide as the lonely, fearful man of the past. Within a year, they were married, and the shop was filled with the sound of joy rather than the hum of cursed clippers. Kwame remained a close friend, often stopping by the shop not just for a haircut, but to share a meal and talk about the world. He never wrote the story of the shadow weaver. Some truths, he realized, were better kept as private victories. The town of Umuzi moved on, the legend of the 10-minute haircut fading into a half-remembered myth. But for Jide, every time he looked into the mirror to check a client's fade, he felt a surge of gratitude. The reflection that once meant certain death was now a symbol of his freedom. He was a man who owned his own hands again, and that was the greatest magic of all. However, the aftermath of such a spiritual upheaval is rarely without its ripples. While Jide was free, the memory of the Golden Hand era lingered in the minds of some who sought power for themselves. In the shadows of Umuzi, a few greedy men wondered if the spirit could be reclaimed. They didn't understand the torment Jide had endured. They only saw the profits and the fame. One such man was a rival barber named Chidi, who operated a struggling shop on the other side of town. Chidi had grown bitter as Jide's fame grew, and even after Jide's slowdown, he felt that Jide still held a secret advantage. Chidi began to investigate the ruins of the old pact, seeking out the same dark shrines that Jide's father had visited decades ago. He didn't realize that the shadow weaver was not a tool to be used, but a predator that consumed its host. He began to experiment with forbidden rituals, hoping to find a shortcut to the success Jide had once enjoyed. He didn't know that Kwame and Jide were watching, aware that the darkness they had banished might try to find a new door to enter. Jide noticed the change in the town's atmosphere before anyone else. He could feel a familiar coldness creeping back into the outskirts of Umuzi. It wasn't his burden anymore, but he knew the signs too well. He spoke to Kwame, and together they visited Babatunde once more. The old seer looked troubled. "The vacuum left by the weaver is being called upon," Tunde warned. "When a spirit is shattered, its essence scatters. But if a heart is dark enough, it can gather the pieces back together. Shidi is playing with fire that will burn the whole town." Jide felt a responsibility he hadn't expected. He had been a victim of the curse, but he was also the only one who truly knew how to fight it. He decided that he couldn't just sit in his peaceful shop while another man fell into the same trap, or worse, brought a new horror to their streets. He and Kwame decided to confront Chidi before his rituals could reach a point of no return. They knew they had to be careful. Desperation makes a man dangerous, and Chidi was very desperate for a taste of Jide's former glory. They found Chidi in a secluded grove at midnight, surrounded by candles and old relics. He was chanting in a voice that sounded strained and unnatural. Jide stepped into the light, his presence commanding. "Stop this, Chidi," Jide said, his voice firm. "You don't know what you are asking for. I lived that life for 20 years, and it is a prison you will never escape." Chidi laughed, a jagged, bitter sound. "You're just afraid I'll be better than you ever were. You had the gift and you threw it away because you are weak. I will be the new legend of Umuzi." As he spoke, the air began to chill, and a faint clicking sound echoed through the trees. The pieces of the shattered weaver were responding to his call. Jide didn't hesitate. He had learned that the only way to fight darkness was the truth of the light. He held up a small mirror, the very first one he had bought for his new shop. "Look at yourself, Chidi. Look at what you are becoming." The reflection caught Chidi's face, which was already beginning to pale and sharpen into a mask of greed. The burgeoning spirit, sensing the reflection, shrieked in frustration. It wasn't strong enough yet to resist even his standard mirror. The shadows that had begun to gather around Chidi dissipated like mist in the sun. Chidi fell to his knees, the unnatural energy leaving him and leaving him exhausted and hollow. Jide walked over and helped him up, much like Kwame had helped Jide on that fateful night. There are no shortcuts to greatness that don't take a piece of your soul, Jide told him gently. Walk with your hands, Chidi. Let them be warm, let them be slow, but let them be yours. Chidi looked at Jide, the realization of his narrow escape finally hitting him. He wept with shame and relief. From that night on, the dark rituals in Umuzi ceased. Jide and Kwame had not only saved a man's life, but had protected the peace of the entire community. The town remained a place where hair was cut slowly, where stories were told in the barber's chair, and where every man could look into the mirror and see himself clearly. As years passed, Jide's sharp cuts became more than just a barber shop. It became a sanctuary of wisdom. Young men would sit in Jide's chair, and while he carefully trimmed their hair, he would tell them stories of the importance of patience and the dangers of seeking power without merit. He became a mentor to many, and his shop was always filled with the warmth of genuine human connection. Kwame eventually wrote a book, though he changed the names and locations to protect the privacy of his friends. It was a story about a man who lost his shadow to find his soul. The book became a bestseller, and while the people of Umuzi made it and smiled, knowing the truth, they kept Jide's secret out of respect. Jide's wife, Amara, gave birth to a son, and Jide vowed that his children would only ever know the value of honest labor. He never let a day go by without appreciating the simple beauty of a reflection, a reminder that he was no longer hiding from anything. The town of Umuzi grew and modernized, but Jide's shop remained a constant, a bridge between the old world and the new. Babatunde eventually passed away, leaving his legacy of wisdom to those who knew how to listen. On his deathbed, he sent a final message to Jide. The mirrors are clear because your heart is clean. Keep the light. Jide took those words to heart. He continued to cut hair until his own hands grew wrinkled and slow, but his spirit remained vibrant. He was a man who had faced the darkest of challenges and emerged into the light, proving that bravery and friendship could overcome even the most ancient curses. The no mirror rule became a distant memory, a tale told to frighten children or entertain tourists. But for those who had lived through it, it was a testament to the power of breaking free. Jide's story taught everyone that it is important to respect people's rules, but it is even more important to speak out when those rules are born of pain. In his final years as a barber, Jide would often stand by the window of his shop and watch the sunset. He no longer felt the coldness of the weaver or the clicking of invisible blades. He felt the warmth of the sun and the love of his family. He knew that he had lived a full life, one defined by his own choices rather than a pact made in his name. When he eventually retired, he handed the shop over to Kofi, who had become a master barber in his own right, one who used mirrors with pride. The shop's name stayed the same, a tribute to the man who had taught the town that true sharpness comes from the character, not just the blade. Jide spent his days in his garden, surrounded by the beauty of nature, finally at peace with the world and himself. His journey from a haunted vessel to a free man was complete, a legacy of light that would shine in Umuzi for generations to come. The story of Jide reminds us all that every person we meet is carrying a burden we may know nothing about. It teaches us that while rules are often there for a reason, we must always have the courage to question those that cause suffering. Friendship, as shown by Kwame's unwavering support, is the strongest weapon against the shadows of our past. Wisdom, as shared by Babatunde, is the guide that leads us through the darkness. And ultimately, bravery, the kind Jide showed when he decided to face his fear, is the key to unlocking the chains that bind us. If you ever find yourself in a place where reflections are forbidden, remember Jide. Remember that the truth is always waiting to be seen, and that no matter how fast or skilled a shortcut may seem, nothing compares to the beauty of a life lived in the light of your own reflection. Thank you for listening to the tale of the man who chose to be slow and free rather than fast and haunted. May your mirrors always show you a heart at peace. Please, if you haven't subscribed, please click on that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, so when I post more interesting stories, you'll be the first to get them. I really appreciate you. I do not take your support for granted. See you in my next video. Bye-bye.